You're living in 15th century Spain. It's evening and there's a knock at your door. Your heart stops. You haven't done anything wrong, at least not that you know of. But that doesn't matter. The visitors standing outside don't need proof. They need confession. Welcome to the Spanish Inquisition, one of history's most misunderstood and genuinely terrifying institutions. Today, we're diving deep into the shadows of medieval Spain to uncover what really happened during the Spanish Inquisition. Forget the myths, the exaggerations, and yes, even the Monty Python sketches. We're going to explore the true story of how faith became a weapon, how fear became policy, and how an entire society was held in the grip of religious authority for over 3 centuries. The year is 1478. Spain is on the cusp of becoming a world power, but it's also a nation fracturing along religious lines. For centuries, the Iberian Peninsula had been a remarkable example of convivencia, a Spanish word meaning coexistence. Christians, Muslims, and Jews had lived side by side, sharing knowledge, trade, and culture. The great libraries of Islamic Spain had preserved ancient Greek philosophy. Jewish scholars had translated crucial texts. Christian kingdom had learned advanced mathematics and astronomy from their Muslim neighbors. But by the late 15th century, this delicate balance was collapsing. King Ferdinand of Aragon and Queen Isabella of Castile had recently married, uniting Spain's 2 largest kingdoms. They had a vision: one Spain, one monarchy, one faith. It was a vision that would require them to remake their entire society, and they would need a powerful tool to do it. That tool would be the Inquisition. Now, here's something crucial to understand. The Spanish Inquisition wasn't the first Inquisition. The Catholic Church had established the medieval Inquisition back in the 12th century to combat heresy, particularly among groups like the Cathars in France. But the Spanish Inquisition was different. It was run not primarily by the Church, but by the Spanish crown. This was a state institution that used religion as its justification. Think of it as the ultimate merger of political and religious power. The official establishment came on November 1, 1478, when Pope Sixtus IV issued a papal bull granting Ferdinand and Isabella permission to appoint inquisitors. The stated goal: to maintain Catholic orthodoxy in their kingdoms. The real goal: to consolidate power, confiscate wealth, and create a unified Christian identity by eliminating religious diversity. The first targets were the conversos, Jews who had converted to Christianity. Some had converted willingly, seeing opportunity in Christian society. Others had converted under duress, during waves of anti-Jewish violence that had swept through Spain in 1391. But here's the cruel irony: conversion wasn't enough. The Inquisition operated on the assumption that many conversos were still secretly practicing Judaism. They were called Marranos, a derogatory term meaning pigs. Can you imagine? You've abandoned your ancestral faith, perhaps even sincerely adopted a new one, and still you're suspect. Still you're watched. Still you're in danger. The Inquisition's first tribunal was established in Seville in 1480. Within months, the Inquisition had identified hundreds of conversos accused of Judaizing, secretly maintaining Jewish practices. On February 6, 1481, 6 people were burned at the stake in the first auto da fe, which literally means act of faith. It was a public ceremony where the accused were paraded through the streets, their sentences pronounced, and punishments carried out. These weren't just executions. They were spectacles designed to terrify the population into obedience. Tomás de Torquemada became the first Grand Inquisitor in 1483, and his name would become synonymous with religious persecution. Torquemada himself was from a converso family, which adds a dark layer of complexity to his zealotry. Perhaps he felt he had something to prove. Under his leadership, the Inquisition expanded rapidly, establishing tribunals in major cities across Spain. By some estimates, during his 15 years in power, about 2,000 people were executed. Thousands more were punished through imprisonment, property confiscation, public humiliation, or forced penance. But how did the Inquisition actually work? How did it identify its victims? The process was insidious. It began with the Edict of Grace, a 30 to 40-day period when people could come forward and confess their heresies. Sounds merciful, right? Here's the catch. If you confessed, you also had to name others. You had to implicate your neighbors, your friends, maybe even your family. Imagine the paranoia this created. Trust evaporated. Communities fractured. Everyone became a potential informant. After the Edict of Grace expired, the Edict of Faith was proclaimed. This called upon everyone to denounce anyone they suspected of heresy, and the list of suspicious behaviors was absurdly broad. Did your neighbor refuse to eat pork? Suspicious. Did they light candles on Friday evening? Suspicious. Did they change their bed linens on Saturday? Suspicious. Did they face the wall when praying? Suspicious. These were everyday actions, but in the eyes of the Inquisition, they could be evidence of secret Jewish practice. Once denounced, you were summoned to appear before the Inquisition. You weren't told who accused you or what specifically you were accused of. You were simply expected to confess. If you confessed and reconciled with the Church, you might escape with your life, though you'd likely lose your property and be forced to wear the sanbenito, a penitential garment that marked you as a convicted heretic for the rest of your life. But what if you refused to confess? What if you insisted on your innocence? This is where things became truly dark. The Inquisition was authorized to use torture to extract confessions. The methods were horrifying. The strapado, where victims were suspended by their wrists tied behind their backs, dislocating shoulders; the rack, which stretched bodies until joints separated; the water torture, an early form of waterboarding. These weren't just punishments. They were tools for manufacturing truth. Under enough pain, people would confess to anything. And here's what made it even more nightmarish. The Inquisition operated under the assumption that confession proved guilt. If you confessed under torture, you were guilty. If you maintained your innocence, you were obstinate, and that proved you were guilty. There was no winning. The Inquisition had about a 95% conviction rate. Think about that. Nearly everyone who came before them was found guilty. This wasn't justice. This was theater. The auto da fe ceremonies were the Inquisition's ultimate theatrical production. They were held in town squares, often on Sundays or feast days when the most people would witness them. The convicted would be led out wearing their sanbenitos, different colors indicating different crimes: green for those who had confessed and reconciled, yellow for lesser heresies, black for those about to be executed. Thousands would gather to watch. Church bells would ring. Officials would process in elaborate ceremonies. The sentences would be read aloud, sometimes taking hours. Then came the executions. The Inquisition technically didn't execute anyone themselves. They would relax the condemned to the secular authorities, who would carry out the burning. This legal fiction allowed the Church to maintain it had never shed blood. The condemned would be tied to stakes, and fires would be lit. If they had reconciled with the Church at the last moment, they might be granted the mercy of being strangled before the flames reached them. If not, they burned alive. But the Inquisition wasn't only about identifying secret Jews. In 1492, the same year Columbus sailed to the Americas, Ferdinand and Isabella issued the Alhambra Decree, expelling all Jews who refused to convert from Spain. Somewhere between 40,000 and 200,000 Jews left everything behind, scattering across Europe, North Africa, and the Ottoman Empire. Many died during the journey. Those who remained and converted became the new generation of conversos, and the cycle of suspicion continued. In 1502, Muslims faced a similar choice: convert or leave. Many converted, becoming known as Moriscos. Like the conversos before them, they too became targets of the Inquisition, suspected of secretly maintaining Islamic practices. The Moriscos would eventually be expelled entirely in 1609, robbing Spain of some of its most skilled artisans and farmers. But the Inquisition didn't limit itself to religious minorities. It expanded its reach to police the behavior of all Christians. Protestant ideas filtering in from the Reformation: heresy. Reading banned books: heresy. proposing scientific ideas that contradicted church teaching, heresy, making certain theological statements, heresy. The Inquisition maintained an index of forbidden books, controlling what people could read and think. Sexual morality also fell under its jurisdiction. It prosecuted bigamy, solicitation by priests during confession, and what it considered unnatural sexual acts. It investigated claims of witchcraft, though interestingly, the Spanish Inquisition was actually more skeptical about witch trials than many other European authorities. The Inquisition often found that accused witches were delusional or victims of local superstition, rather than actual practitioners of witchcraft. Even an institution as brutal as the Inquisition could have strange pockets of relative rationality. What about the scale of the violence? This is where myth and reality diverge. For centuries, the black legend, anti-Spanish propaganda promoted by Protestant countries and Spain's political rivals, claimed the Inquisition killed hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions. Modern scholarship paints a different, though still disturbing, picture. Historians estimate that over the Inquisition's roughly 350-year existence, about 3,000 to 5,000 people were executed. Tens of thousands more were punished through other means: imprisonment, torture, property confiscation, public humiliation. Now, 3,000 to 5,000 executions might sound almost modest compared to the inflated numbers of the Black Legend. But let's be clear, this was still an atrocity. Each of those numbers was a person. A life ended in terror and pain. And the true damage of the Inquisition can't be measured only in execution statistics. It's measured in the atmosphere of fear it created, in the communities it destroyed, in the culture of surveillance and suspicion it normalized. Spain lost some of its greatest minds. Scholars fled. Books were burned. Intellectual inquiry was stifled. There's a historical debate about whether the Inquisition contributed to Spain's eventual decline as a world power. Some historians argue that by expelling Jews and Muslims, Spain lost valuable human capital: merchants, craftsmen, scholars, and professionals. Others point out that Spain's decline had multiple causes: economic mismanagement, costly wars, and competition from other European powers. But there's no question the Inquisition left deep scars on Spanish society. It created a culture obsessed with blood purity, where having even distant Jewish or Muslim ancestry could bar you from universities, religious orders, and government positions. This concept of limpieza de sangre, cleanliness of blood, persisted long after the Inquisition's power had waned. It's an uncomfortable truth that would later echo in other attempts to define national or racial purity in European history. The Inquisition's power gradually diminished over the centuries. The Enlightenment brought new ideas about reason, tolerance, and human rights that were fundamentally incompatible with the Inquisition's methods. The last execution for heresy occurred in 1826. The Inquisition was finally, officially abolished in 1834, though by that point it had been largely powerless for decades. So what can we learn from the Spanish Inquisition? First, we see how easily religious faith can be weaponized for political purposes. Ferdinand and Isabella didn't create the Inquisition primarily out of theological concern. They used it to consolidate power, confiscate wealth from wealthy conversos and Moriscos, and forge a unified national identity. Religion became the justification for what was essentially state terror. Second, we see the danger of certainty. The inquisitors believed they were absolutely right. They believed they were saving souls by torturing bodies. They believed that heresy was so dangerous that any method of combating it was justified. This absolute certainty made them capable of extraordinary cruelty while believing themselves righteous. History shows us repeatedly what happens when people become so convinced of their own correctness that they dehumanize those who disagree. Third, we see how fear transforms society. The Inquisition didn't need to investigate everyone. The threat of investigation was enough. People censored themselves, informed on each other, performed their orthodoxy publicly while living in private terror. This is the power of fear-based control. It makes people police themselves and each other. Fourth, we see the importance of due process and legal protections. The Inquisition operated in secret. The accused didn't know their accusers, didn't have access to evidence, couldn't mount a proper defense. These aren't just legal technicalities. They're fundamental protections against tyranny. When we eliminate them, we open the door to exactly this kind of abuse. But here's what we shouldn't learn from the Spanish Inquisition. We shouldn't use it to condemn faith itself. The Inquisition wasn't the inevitable result of religious belief. It was the result of specific political and social conditions, of power-hungry rulers, of economic pressures, of xenophobia and fear of difference. Many people of faith opposed the Inquisition's excesses. Many protected its victims. Some priests risked their own safety to help conversos and Moriscos escape. The Spanish Inquisition is a reminder that the human capacity for cruelty doesn't require religion, though religion can certainly be used to justify it. It's a reminder that we're all capable of participating in systems of oppression if we're not vigilant. The people who denounced their neighbors weren't all monsters. Many were ordinary people, afraid for their own safety, pressured by authority, convinced they were doing the right thing. Today, when we hear the phrase Spanish Inquisition, it's often as a joke or a reference to unexpected events. But the real Spanish Inquisition was no joke. It was a centuries-long tragedy that destroyed lives, shattered communities, and impoverished a nation intellectually and culturally. It stands as one of history's clearest examples of what happens when fear, power, and absolute certainty combine. We live in a world that still struggles with many of the same issues: the tension between security and freedom, the temptation to scapegoat minorities, the allure of absolute certainty, the use of fear as a political tool. The Spanish Inquisition is separated from us by centuries, but its lessons remain urgent. How do we balance the need for social cohesion with respect for diversity? How do we resist the temptation to other those who are different? How do we maintain our principles when we're afraid? These aren't easy questions, and I don't pretend to have all the answers, but I do know this. Understanding history, really understanding it in all its complexity and horror and humanity, is how we avoid repeating it. The Spanish Inquisition happened. Thousands died. Millions lived in fear. Communities that had coexisted for centuries were destroyed, and it was all done in the name of righteousness. So the next time someone invokes the Spanish Inquisition as a historical example or a cautionary tale, remember the real people behind the statistics. Remember the converso family gathered in secret to light Sabbath candles, terrified a neighbor might see. Remember the Morisco trying to explain that washing before prayer is just cleanliness, not heresy. Remember the merchant who lost everything because someone coveted his property and found a way to denounce him. Remember the Inquisitor who genuinely believed he was saving souls, who couldn't see the evil he was doing because he was so certain of his righteousness. History isn't simple, people aren't simple, but some lessons are clear enough. Fear is a terrible foundation for any society. Absolute certainty is dangerous. Power without accountability leads to abuse. And human dignity, the right to believe, to think, to exist without terror, that's worth defending, even when it's difficult, even when we're afraid. The Spanish Inquisition ended nearly 200 years ago, but its shadow still stretches across history, a reminder of what we're capable of at our worst, and what we must resist if we want to be our best. If you found this deep dive into one of history's darkest chapters valuable, consider subscribing to Neural Battlefields. We explore the moments where human nature, power, and belief collide throughout history. Hit that like button if this changed how you think about the Spanish Inquisition, and share it with anyone who's interested in understanding not just what happened in history, but why it matters today. There's always more to uncover, more to understand, more to learn from the battles that shaped our world. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.